Right. So, good afternoon again and again, my dear students and colleagues and future colleagues, etc. So, today we are talking about, today is the fourth and the last lecture of our mini course, if you wish, or my visit. So, we're terminating today's course with understanding and misunderstanding in the communication. So, today we are going to talk a little bit more about the issues and the subjects that we have covered yesterday. So we have spoken yesterday about the hinders of communication or obstacles of communication, right? Such as language barriers, such as cultural barriers, such as sometimes when body language has a mismatch, etc. So today we are going to dive in a little bit in understanding and misunderstanding and misinterpretation and interpretation issues generally. And in the end, as a let's say as a matter of agenda, we will also give you some tips and takeaways of how you can communicate with the other audiences to make your communication patterns a little bit better and maybe not to leave more gaps for misinterpretation or misunderstanding, right? So, as we mentioned before, and more concretely yesterday, sometimes miscommunication and misinterpretation happens because people just misinterpret certain things. So, there is no evil mastermind behind, and there is not necessarily evil thought or intention, right? So sometimes people really misunderstand what you say, and there is not because they have some prejudice or stereotype against you, or maybe they also are linguistically in your group, so they understand your language, but it can be like purely, human phenomenon that someone misunderstood something. But of course, there is a labeling of misunderstanding in the communication studies. So for that, we need to know certain definitions of what is communication, let's say when communication is successful, and I have touched upon it yesterday as well. And what is the specifics of communication that makes it so hard? Sometimes people believe, okay, I speak what I speak, and then, they, of course, they understand what I speak. But actually, we already have seen yesterday that this understanding, it depends on cultural, social, linguistic factors. That is also not limited, of course, to intentional barriers such as a communication noise, such as stereotypes, misjudgment, prejudice, etc., right? So we will start with a little bit of intro here. We will label the misunderstanding. So we need to understand ourselves what is a misunderstanding when it comes to the communication studies, especially when we talk about the cross-cultural communication, especially when you study conflict and communication or communication studies during the crisis, right? In crisis management. So we say that communication is basically an interaction. This is an attempt to give someone verbal or non-verbal signals where you have encoding involved, as we said yesterday. So you have a message, and then the sender tries to send the message through signals, through non-verbal sensory information, such as gestures or mimicry on face, etc. And then it is receiver's job to accept this message and decode it in a certain way, right? So we say that communication is only successful when both sender and receiver understand the same information. Now you might have a logical question, how do I know if I send particular information, right? What's my guarantee that the other person understands it? Unfortunately, I would say that 30% of the misunderstanding cases, cultural misunderstanding cases, of course, arise because we assume that the message that we give and the message that is received are, interpreted in the same way. Actually, it is not so. It can be quite different, right? So the guarantees do not exist, but you can always ask for clarification if there is particular, a little bit of a doubt if you interpreted the information successfully, or otherwise you can also ask for a feedback. So feedback asking, maybe you have had this question before, right? You go to some nice, I don't know, you go to some nice restaurant, or you go to other country, or you use some service, right? And everyone is constantly asking you for a feedback. Haven't you ever had the question, oh my God, why are they so interested in this feedback? Because oftentimes people are interested in their own performance. I'm not downgrading your opinions, okay? Of course, your opinion matters, but oftentimes it gives information to the sender of the signal how the signal was perceived. So maybe the signal was not perceived the way you intended the first place. And of course, the feedback will be negative, right? For instance, I'm sure you all had the cases when you give some feedback about the touristic service or some information agency in your country, right? And then you write, oh, those people did not listen to me, or they did not react in a certain way. Well, maybe partially the problem is that you also misperformed and they also misinterpreted, right? So that helps you as well to understand what is going on when you are sending particular signals. So let's say like that, feedback system is not only to get a praise, or for example get criticism, right? Oh, I like for example this TED talk, TED conference talks. I like this TED talk, or I don't like this TED talk. But rather it is also for the speaker to understand to what level did the audience really get the information or get the signal which was sent to them. So one of the major difficulties of communication is that it is bidirectional. So unfortunately, the problem arises when you need to make sure that the person understands everything the same way as you said it, and they understand it in the same way as you wanted it to be understood, right? Sometimes it happens that you say something and the people get, people get misunderstanding of your message, and as a result you need to clarify then, right? So it's very simple thing, but we often call this communication distortion. So communication distortion happens when you start to interpret the message as you would interpret it in a sense, so based on your culture. For example, if I say, oh, I don't like when people are late, for example, right? This is the example that I have remembered right now. I might not intend to say something more, so I just say, oh, I don't like when people are late. But then, depending on your distortion or the distortion around you, you might understand, oh, so I need to be always punctual because she doesn't like when I'm late. But I have never said that. I just said that I don't like when things are late. And this does not necessarily mean that it refers to you, right? So sometimes we accept on ourselves some of the messages that might not be intended that much for us, right? So one of my first conversations in Cyprus was about, so I met my acquaintance who lives on Cyprus, and she asked me, oh, how is it? And I said, oh, it's a good weather. It's fantastic, actually. I love warm, especially when I came from Sweden. It feels so hot. And she started to excuse Cyprus weather. So she was like, yeah, it's a little bit too hot for this season, but thanks God you are not in summer. And I understood that she interpreted it as criticism rather than just the fact that it is relatively hot compared to Sweden, where it is like today it's 5 degrees, right? So 25 degrees here is much more warmer temperature. Again, it was never intended as a criticism, but the person, based on their own their own prejudices and their own opinions, accepted it as a criticism. Also, this often happens when, for example, you go to the countries, you travel as a tourist, right, especially, and you then say something that, might be offensive to the other cultures. For example, people often come to Georgia and they say, oh, but there are a lot of food. There's a lot of food everywhere, so Georgians eat a lot. And of course, we say, like, yeah, we kind of like food. What's the problem with that? So then they come back is always, what is your problem with that if we like food? So, some cultures and some representatives of some cultures might think that it is a little bit offensive. So, based on their own background, they might distort the information. Haven't you ever had this case when you give someone a compliment, or, you want to say a good thing? Oh, for example, oh, your hair looks fantastic today. And they are slightly offended because that means that for them, it means that any other day their hair looks bad, right? But you never intended it in that way because your context was strictly positive. So my attempt here is to tell you that even if your feedback or your compliment or your sentence or the signal that you send is positive, based on the person's, background, distortion, information, or distorted environment, they might interpret it in a negative way still. So therefore, we often say that, okay, I'm telling you directly that this is so, and honestly, right? So you don't need to put other context. Also, this is a very peculiar subject for the context, for the cultures of the high context. So cultures which have high level of secrecy, privacy, etc., they like to read between the lines. There is such expression, read between the lines. So you have to understand what people means when they tell you something, even if they don't tell you that. I remember there was an example which we studied when I was, a student many, many years ago, but it was about exactly high context cultures. For instance, high context culture will tell you when you sit in the room and it's very hot, like very, very hot, right? So context is important, right? Read between the lines. So you go in the room and there is a person sitting. And in high context culture, a person tells you, for example, Georgia is a high context culture. Turkey is a high context culture. They will tell you, it's hot, isn't it? So the idea is that you need to interpret this signal correctly and you need to come back with the question, oh, would you like me to open the window? So they don't want to tell you what to do because they don't want to give you an order, but rather they ask you, oh, don't you think it's a little bit too hot in here? And they come back naturally is, oh, do you want me to open the door, open the window? Do you want me to turn on the air conditioning? Right? So that is a high context. And I'm sure that some of you might have same experience with the parents and elderly generation because they are a little bit of the high context representatives. So it also happens in the elder generation that they try to be delicate, but at the same time, they rely on you to interpret the information very significantly. The second case of the low context culture or more direct culture, such as US, for example, very good example, when you enter in the same situation, it's hot in the room, right? You enter in the room, and the person who is sitting in the room, if they are representatives of the US, most probably they will tell you, could you please open the window? It's too hot. So it's direct, it's indirect request, but at the same time, they directly tell you what they want and why do they want it. So in first case, it's too hot in here, isn't it? That is up to your interpretation, and you need to ask then follow-up question, right? Oh, would you like me to open the window? And it also leads to opening the window. In the second case, in the low context culture representation case, they also tell you, it's too hot, so could you please like open the window right now? And of course, it again ends in the same result, opening the window. So this is just a small example to make you understand that sometimes, and to illustrate that sometimes the simplest situations, it should not be like really big conflict or, peace negotiations or something. It can be like really small, but actually it is misinterpreted, and you need to read between the lines when it comes to certain cultures, right? So we have labeling, of course, of misunderstanding, and we do have sometimes we say that it's kind of hard to have labeled misunderstanding. What does it mean? Where does misunderstanding come from? Is this pragmatic failure? So do I not want to open the window, so I consciously misunderstand your message because I don't want to understand it? Or is it just because it's a pure accident, right? Because accidents happen. We say that there are certain situations in which you need to understand how misunderstanding and misinterpretation can, overlap with each other, but they do have key distinctions. So you can never say that misinterpretation and misunderstanding are the same. And there is a reason why do we say that. First of all, the first factor we say that differentiates, the biggest difference between misunderstanding and misinterpretation is time. So here we mean that misunderstanding typically happens after the fact. So you had your communication with the person, you think that they understood everything, but then it appears that they didn't. All right, so that is the time when you understand that this person had some misunderstanding moment. So they didn't exactly grasp what you have said to them, right? So that is a little bit confusion. And so end result, it is, so you find it out later when someone misunderstood your information. What about misinterpretation? So misinterpretation is more immediate. So misinterpretation happens very fast after the signal is given. And that also means that you might not correctly comprehend something. But misinterpretation can happen during debate. For example, misinterpretation can happen during the lecture. For instance, I said something and you're not sure if that is correctly interpreted, right? So you ask, oh, but what's your take on that? I really don't know. How do you interpret that? I need more clarification. That is misinterpretation. Misunderstanding is when you say that, okay, everything is clear, I understood everything, and then you write a test, for example, right? Maybe that happens also in your life of the, student. In the course, you write exam or you write a paperwork, and this concept, which you thought you understood so well, professor says, okay, no, like here was some type of a problem, so you need to sit down and read it again. That is when you understand that, okay, wait a second, so did I misunderstand this? Because I thought I grasped it correctly. So that happens afterwards. Whereas misinterpretation is very immediate, like it's right in the moment of the communication. Control is the second factor. So the opportunity to clarify generally rises fast, right? So, but it depends on whether we are talking about misunderstanding or misinterpretation. So just because misinterpretation needs shorter time, you have more control over a situation. So when misinterpretation happens, you can very easily detect it right from the beginning. By asking a question or by giving feedback, or if you give a speech to your classmates, right, getting feedback from them. How do you think? Did you interpret this correctly? Or do you think that everything is clear? So when you get this and there is particular element that has been a little bit misinterpreted, of course, you understand that it should be clarified before it solidifies into the problem. On the other hand, if you have a misunderstanding again, just because that is why timing is the most important. So just because the time has gone and you have explored maybe after 2 weeks that you have misunderstood something, right? And you're like, okay, I understand everything. And then suddenly it hits you, oh, wait a second, I do not actually understand this concept. So I need additional clarification. So it can be a little bit hard to go back and understand that past concept 15 days ago, right? Because time has gone. So this timing factor affects the control factor, sorry. And so you have misunderstanding, which is harder to solve because the time has passed. And on the other hand, you have misinterpretation, which is easier to solve because it has been just, happened maybe, it had just happened maybe an hour ago or so. Blame. In the private communication or individual communication, you have blame, which is also a factor. So misunderstandings often have a very dramatic flavor. So, for example, misunderstanding is more failure. It's not always easy to say, I misunderstood, right? I mean, if you have ever had that situation when you have made a mistake, so you really misunderstood something, it's hard to recognize it. It's hard to say, oh, professor, 15 days ago, I thought that I understood it, but actually it seems I misunderstood. Because unfortunately, there is a stigma that misunderstanding is a little bit more failure. So if you if you misunderstand something, that is associated with, oh, okay, so I failed, which is not true. That is just situational moment, right? You misunderstood something. It's completely okay. But still, somehow the person does not like to say, okay, I misunderstood this. So, it's a little bit of a self-doubt. Why? I have brain. I thought a lot about this and I thought I understood, but then it appears I didn't understand correctly. So what is going on with me, right? So the fault is on me. So that is a little bit, that is why also stigmatized idea to say that, oh, I misunderstood what you said and I apologize for that, right? Whereas misinterpretation is more neutral. So misinterpretation, it does not assign any error. So like very big failure or something. So for example, you can say, oh, can I make sure that I have correctly interpreted what you have just said? So that is, again, I would say, but this is my personal opinion, that just because timing is a factor, right? And you have more control also over misinterpretation. There is an opportunity to understand that misinterpretation is a little bit more neutral. So it's completely okay. For example, you say good evening, and no, you say good afternoon, and I might misinterpret it into good evening, right? And I might answer not good afternoon, but I might come back with, oh, good evening. But actually, we are in the same country right now, right? So that is misinterpretation from my side. So I misinterpret the information, and that's completely okay. But if, for example, it's something more serious and some time has gone by, and then I understand that I receive a bad mark or bad comment or, and then I understand, okay, I misunderstood this concept, that would make me feel a little bit more of a failure than misinterpretation. And damage. So when you talk about the scale of the damage between those two, so misunderstanding and misinterpretation, you have some of the key data here. So in the damage context, misunderstanding is always more problematic. Again, if you work in the research or if you work in the academia, etc., it doesn't matter, even in friendships. So if you have a misunderstanding and you don't address it, and the time goes by, right? That's the misunderstanding. So the time goes and you dramatize it, then of course the damage is much bigger to self. So you start to be more self-critical, you start to have some self-doubt, you start to, question everything. Oh my God, do I know this? Do I actually know this subject? Like, do I actually understand what I'm reading, or is that, just my illusion? So this data or research or whatever you work on often is, perceived as useless because you have misunderstood something. Rather, misinterpretation, it is a little bit less damaging because it can be fastly corrected. So before it actually makes some big detrimental effect on the on the studying process or on the understanding process, you can already, let's say, fix it easily, right? Immediately. Therefore, damage can be minimized to the bigger level. Now, I want to show you something. You already understand that I like to use multimedia material. So I want to show a video which belongs to 2017. And that is a very famous video. I don't know if you've been following North Korean politics or if you know anything about North Korean politics and towards the South Korea. But you know that North Korea is a strict socialistic republic and they are absolutely isolated. So from the outside world, and you know that they have a very strong doctrine. Um, and after 1950s, in 2017, it was the first case in the world when a North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, had a famous handshake moment with South Korea's leader, Moon Jae-in. That was a very big event in world politics. And when you see the video, because the video is extract from the BBC, let's say, address that BBC had, the live stream of that moment. So it was so vital. It was so important that you can understand that, even BBC, everyone was like very interested and everyone was very engaged in this process. So they do make comments, and I would also ask you very much to listen to comments. We will not need whole video, but I will stop it whenever it needs to be stopped. But anyways, look and enjoy, because that will be very interesting in terms of later on discussion about misinterpretation and misunderstanding. Oh, I absolutely love this video, and that is enough here. But that is like legendary case for me to discuss in terms of intercultural and cross-cultural communication. So you would hear in the beginning, if you had an opportunity to hear audio, that they are talking that this is a legendary moment. So this is the best moment. This is the legendary moment. Now is the time that we are talking about ceasefire agreements. Now is the time that we are talking about, peace. Not only they shook hands, but they also planted a tree. So just to make it clear, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has never been, after 1950s again, he, like any North Korean leader, none of them have never been to South Korea. And that small place with the stones, it was a border. So they are going back and forth, right? So Kim Jong-un not only handshook the South Korean leader Moon Jae-in, but also he crossed the border. So he went in the south, and you saw how people were, like upward and happy, and they're like, oh, now there is this handshake and the hope. Well, I want to tell you that this information was a little bit misinterpreted. As you know, it's so significant when we talk about misinterpretation because people started to build a huge hope that this handshake, this historical handshake, would lead to peace agreements, ceasefire agreements, that Kim Jong-un often examines missiles, rockets, and nuclear weapons near the South Korean border. So that was also a hope that this handshake would give a raise to new ceasefire agreements. So this handshake would start, the peace and everything. Unfortunately, Kim Jong-un himself had no such idea. And after these videos were released, I'm telling you, this was a live, that we have recorded because it was, a big thing, of course. And then we all waited. And after a week approximately, Kim Jong-un just came out and said, like, I'm not going to change anything in my politics. So what's the big deal about this handshake? So I can shake hands, no problem, but why is there additional meaning that was tied to that gesture? Not only he did not sign anything, but he continued to try his missiles and rockets near South Korea. So actually, that handshake had no tangible result. So this is a very typical case of how the whole world, and including South Korea, of course, because South Korean leader also looks pretty happy and he meets these children with the flowers and everything, right? So this is the typical case how whole world misinterpreted that just because Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, decided to cross the border, conflicting border, and handshake with the leader, right, that would automatically mean some type of the peace, which it didn't. So it was, of course, it's very interesting case, right? Because if the same will happen in Cyprus, maybe people will assume the same, right? So that this handshake moment between leaders from the country which is totally isolated from the world, right? And no one can talk to this guy. You saw that he has like almost 30 bodyguards, etc. So that was a legendary moment. But then he also made sure that people stopped misinterpreting. So I think after a week maximum, he came out with the announcement and he said, like, I don't really understand what is going on. I mean, I'm not changing my politics. I'm not changing my ideology. I'm not changing my missiles, whether you like it or no. So it is a very typical case how one signal can be misunderstood and misinterpreted. So for whole world, it was a little bit of misunderstanding. So it was a little bit dramatized later on, of course, as well. But for himself, for Kim Jong-un, it was just a misinterpretation. He was like, they misinterpreted my gesture, so let me clear this up. So he cleared this up himself, actually. And then, of course, we need to speak about the science of misunderstanding or the source of misunderstanding. So how to detect when there is a misunderstanding, right? So you will detect it by looking at the person. Maybe the person is partially or totally is deviant from what the speaker intended to communicate. So you need to make sure that the person, giving you some nonverbal signals such as nodding of the head or maybe saying, yes, I understood. There are many different signals that you can give to the person so that they will understand that they have been interpreted correctly. Also, misunderstanding is a cognitive phenomenon which belongs to the sender or interlocutor, of course. And the sender who misunderstands is not aware of it. So oftentimes it happens that when I say something as a sender of the information, I might not really understand if it is clear enough or no. So I send this signal because I think it is clear. Same in the situation of Kim Jong-un, for instance, right? So Kim Jong-un thought that this handshake was just a handshake, and it was a very clear, just a bodily sensory interaction, right? So sensory interaction with Moon Jae-in, which did not include any additional, hypothetical or symbolical points, which it did for the other side, right? So we often say that misunderstanding is not a cognitive act. So it does not happen when you actually think, oh, now I need to misunderstand this information, right? You don't think like that, unless of course there is some evil intention. But rather it is just a momentary situational inability of the hearer to get the signal correctly. So for instance, as it was intended, I would not say correctly, but as it was intended by the sender. So it's not when you sit down and you think, okay, now is the time to misunderstand something. It's not like that, right? So you actually think that you follow the conversation, but then it appears that you have misunderstood part of it, for instance. And misunderstanding is normally corrected in the ongoing discourse. So again and again, oftentimes there is a stigma associated with misunderstanding, and people believe that, oh, you misunderstood something, that is a failure. So I think that this is also very important to realize that misunderstanding is not a stigma. It is just a situational problem that can be solved very easily in the due course. We call it a due course because, for instance, if you work at the project or if you work on the project and then you misunderstood something, right? And then you start, of course, to react in a certain way, and then this is somehow somehow it is regulated later on. So actually it can be fixed, right? So this fixing is absolutely possible that we are talking about. So misunderstanding is more dramatic than misinterpretation. However, again, it is possible to solve it later on. Now, how to solve the misunderstanding and misinterpretation? So, how do we make sure that this does not happen to us, right? So, when we do something, how do we know how people accept it and how people actually interact with it? So, first is, of course, the feedback, as I have already mentioned to you. So, importance of feedback. Feedback can be verbal and nonverbal. So, for instance, if you sit in front of the audience or if you stand in front of the audience, right, then often you need to make an eye contact with your audience, and they even teach you how to do that, right? So, oftentimes people tell you, oh, and this is like the basics of rhetorics, right? So, when you address the audience and public speaking, they tell you, oh, you need to look the audience into the eyes, so you need to have some eye contact. The second is to observe the body language, such as nodding the head, or, for example, making small gestures which make you understand that the person is naturally following the conversation. Encouraging questions and providing thoughtful responses to enhance audience's participation, right? That is why maybe you also had a question like this before. Why is it so that every lecturer and I'm sure this is for every lecture that you have ever had in your life, right? So they ask you, oh, do you have questions? And you say like, um, no. And then you also might have a little bit of a problem with that. You might be thinking, oh, why is this person so obsessed with this? Like question, 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 right? So that is again an opportunity for the interlocutor or the person who is trying to, communicate with you to understand whether this is actually effective type of communication or no. So for instance, if the communication is effective, you will most probably understand everything and you will say, okay, that was clear, right? So some type of the feedback will be given. But if you have a doubt that you misinterpreted information, such an opportunity when the professor asks you, oh, do you have any questions, right? And you say, okay, like this is very important task for me. So here is this. I'm not sure that I interpreted it correctly. So it gives you an opportunity to avoid misunderstanding. Similarly, when you do the presentation at the conference, etc., you always finish up with the, do you have any questions for me, right? Because you want to make sure that people actually follow what you are saying, or they might have some difficulty and they might need some clarification. So instead of dramatizing later on, it is better if everything is explained right there and then. So the last one is, of course, to use live polls and surveys. There are plenty of survey platforms nowadays that actually gather the audience's opinions. It happens often that, this method is more used in the workshops, for instance. In the science, we use it for workshops more. So during the workshop, for example, we say like, okay, now is your time to, fill up some feedback department. And you can also say, did I enjoy this, for example, workshop? And there are percentages, right, in the end that you can see, etc. So it's a quite easy tool also to use, especially when you have a conference or workshop or seminar and you want the feedback on that from the wider audience. However, I would say that it is also good for the audiences where you are not sure that everyone wants to talk, so people are different, personalities are different. So someone might be very uncomfortable with talking. So then this can be the way, actually, service and pulse, especially for those people who work in teaching, let's say in the school classroom, not that much at the university level, but in the school classroom where you can actually make a beautiful poll and you can make beautiful, graphs and ask them their opinion about the lesson. And that might be very helpful for some of the students who are a little bit introverted and they don't want to express their opinion openly, maybe. Common criminals of misunderstanding. So we have common blaming factors when you misunderstand some information or when someone misunderstands you. So we do have statistical common, let's say, factors. The first is tone of the voice. So for instance, if someone tells you, oh, this was interesting, that type of the voice, which is absolutely expression of when you are very tired, right? And on the other hand, when you say, oh, this was an interesting one, right? So it's more, it sounds more optimistic at least. So sometimes and oftentimes, you might have friends or you might have relatives and you say something and they tell you, oh, don't shout. And then you start to excuse yourself and say, but I don't shout, I just talk. And then they feel offended. So that is the case of the tone of the voice. Sometimes when you say something louder than usually, and you don't necessarily measure it, right? We don't go with the decibel meter controlling, okay, now I talk on 20 decibels. That is not so, right? So sometimes when you say something louder and people tell you, like, in your surrounding, right? Your friends, don't shout on me. And you're like, I'm not shouting. It's just, I just express myself. So that can be the case when tone of the voice actually works. Past experiences, the second one. So Past experiences refer to maybe negative experiences that affect your way of communication or also affect your way of understanding, you know? For instance, oh, that's a good one. I would tell you that, after a war, so post-war societies like Georgia is, the PTSD syndrome, one of the post-traumatic experiences is when you hear, it's audible sound. So when you hear some sounds that are connected to the sounds that you have heard during your traumatic experience, it can be quite alarming. So it is always very problematic for me when I hear a helicopter, for example, somewhere close, because I come from traumatized society, right? So I had PTSD as well as almost all population of Georgia has it after 2008. So certain sounds are very closely connected to the alarm. I don't connect helicopter to the war, but I connect helicopter to the alarm. So I become restless, for example. So every time I hear helicopter, and that's not a plane because I'm more or less used to that sound, right? But helicopter in my brain, it's something emergency. I'll tell you another one, which is oftentimes the case, the police sirens, you know, when the police moves, right? And that's also audible experience, audio experience of the past. But if you know this is a police siren, right? So, and if it is near you, most probably you start to think that something is going on, right? So you start to interpret the situation, but you don't actually know what is going on, which is leading to misunderstanding. So that's a common thing. Of course, there are a little bit more dramatic ones as well. For instance, there are multiple TV shows nowadays about mixed couples and mixed marriages. So if in the mixed marriage something happens and cultures do not understand each other, and then they, break up, the negative experience about that nation stays with you almost forever. So it's very less likely that if you had, a serious conflict with, I don't know, friend or a partner from different country, and that was the only person that you knew from that country, but you had serious misunderstandings, then it is less likely that you will go in the same country to have another partner. So you will not most probably have a friend or partner from the same other country because your past experiences, of course, affect your mode of communication and the way you understand the information. Mood, attitude, and other related communication noise. And as I said today, first power hierarchy. So power hierarchy, we spoke about that yesterday a little bit. Power hierarchy is when you give a feedback to your boss and your boss does not want to listen, not because you say some unreasonable thing, but because they are the boss. So it's not because you've been unreasonable, but rather it is because they have a power hierarchy. So they are maybe not ready to exactly listen to you. So that is when the power hierarchy plays its role. Mood, attitude, and other related communication noise. So all those things that disturb you to understand the message of the interlocutor, of the sender, is called communication noise. So communication noise distracts you, it disturbs you, so that in the end you really don't understand the message correctly. Either you misinterpret it or you misunderstand it. Mood, during many years, people can change their mood, maybe like 5 times a day even, right? So it depends on. For example, I can tell you that personally I have SAD, which is a seasonal depression. And that means that when the seasons change, I start to become less active and less happy. So I am a little bit, in a mild mood always when the seasons change. So when the spring is over, for example, and summer comes, I'm a little bit, lack of energy. I'm sleepy. I really don't want to interact that much. etc. So my mood definitely affects my communication style. I prefer to go and sleep, for example, rather than to go out with my friends, which normally would not be the case. So normally I would go out with the friends, but there are certain mood swings when, I don't do that. And I'm sure you all have those things, right? Not SAD, may God save you from that, but maybe you have some, moments in life or moments in everyday reality when you really don't go out because you don't have that much time, right? And you don't want that attitude. So sometimes it happens that your attitude changes. I can give you a good example on, for example, alcoholics, right? So if person is very friendly with the alcohol and they go out and they communicate with the friends about that issue, but then they decide to sober up. So they go to the rehab or anonymous alcoholic societies. Same can be about smoking, by the way. So maybe you gave up on smoking or on alcohol. You might not be willing to communicate around alcohol in the same way. So let's say you might, just because you have changed your attitude towards life, you start to have different hobbies and you start to have different interests. So maybe don't interact anymore with the people who are still smoking and still drinking if you gave up on those habits, right? So your attitude has changed. I'm bringing these examples because those habits are actually life attitude rather than, it's not about values because your values do not change that much. I mean, your values are given, right? Your values, you develop them early in your childhood and more or less this kindness, love, friendliness. I don't think that they change so easily. But if you have a life habit that you did, and now your attitude towards life has changed and you want something else, right? That can be quite hard to communicate with the people with the same old interests. This a little bit explains changed communication pattern over the years. I don't know if you have noticed it around you. I have noticed it around me, in my friends and in my relatives. People change friends. Have you ever seen that the friends that you had in the school or high school might not be the same friends that you have now? Some of you can be lucky enough, right, to keep that friends from the past, but most of you might have another circle, another friendship circle. And that is natural. There is nothing unnatural about it. There is nothing that is, your fault or something like that. The thing is, your attitude has changed, and you want the people who communicate with you in the way that they also exhibit the same attitude. And other related communication noise. It can be literally noise. So if my neighbor plays music very loudly, right? I will not be able to hear anything. That is also communication noise. Because if I misunderstand you because there is some type of the noise outside that disturbs me, that's also noise. But also, noise can be understood as indirect reference to attitudes, to culture, beliefs, etc., that are different for you, so that disturb you from understanding the message. And cultural differences, of course, because sometimes it happens that cultural differences are very big, very dramatic, and in such case, of course, misunderstanding is absolutely going to happen. So I think I told you that, well, I used the example of punctuality, but for instance, if you go to Eastern cultures, so they have, and I mean Islamic Eastern cultures, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, such as United Arab Emirates, etc. So when they tell you that meeting is at 3 o'clock, even if you're late a little bit, like 3:10 or 3:15, it's okay. They can also be late. So the people that you are meeting, they can also be late because in culture, they have the idea that if you are very busy, you can be sometimes late. Right? So that is approximately the idea that so that person is so busy that they need to find the time to meet you. right? So that's a little bit also hierarchy, but they always underline, okay, I found the time to meet you, right? Or you need to say, oh, I thank you that you found the time to meet me today. That's the thing. About more linear cultures, like, for example, Germany, 3 o'clock is 3 o'clock. End of story. I will tell you this on the very funny example of the bus schedules. Every country where I go to, and I've been to many countries by now, I'm not boasting, but that's just as a reference. So every country has different understanding of the bus schedule. So for instance, when in Georgia, bus schedule says it will arrive in 0 minutes, most probably it has already gone. And this zero is written because it has gone. I explored that in Nicosia, that is not so. So when it says 0 minutes, it is actually there at the bus stop. In Georgia, it's gone. In Nicosia, it's at the bus stop. And in Sweden, it is arriving. So when it says 0, that means that it is, arriving. So it's very close. So it is going to be there. Also, for instance, in Georgia, it's more about 5-minute intervals. So, for instance, the bus arrives at 5:05, 5:10, 5:15, etc. So more like this, It is very rare that the bus will arrive in 5:32. So it doesn't work like that. But for Sweden, it works like that. So for instance, you might have a schedule in Sweden of the bus that says, oh, it will arrive at 5:31 and it leaves at 5:32. And you are like, okay, but that's basically 5:30. But no, they will tell you, no, it's 5:31. So each minute counts as a time, time element, part of the time. So that is a cultural difference that is reflected even in the smallest, tiniest details. So, for instance, if you live in the community of Georgia, right, and you see 0 on the schedule in Nicosia, you might think, oh my God, this bus has gone away. And then you see the bus there, right? And then you go and ask them, why didn't you leave? Because it says 0, right? And for Nicosia, it's natural that on 0, this bus number stands there. So you might have a little bit of misunderstanding with the driver or with your own touristic agency, or maybe with your own plans, right? So you are planning your day throughoutly and you try to make to every location accordingly with the public transport. So that might also create a little bit of a misunderstanding there. Effective delivery techniques. So when you deliver any type of communication, especially when addressing the public speaking issues, because I'm sure that at one point in your job or in your career, you will need to address the public speaking issues. So some of the tools can help you to become a little bit more clear, a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit more engaging, etc., right? So first of all, we would say that pitch variation is the one. So sometimes you need to go up in your voice, sometimes you need to go down. I know it's a little bit hard to control it like that, rationally and cognitively when you speak. Oh, do I have to go up here? Do I have to go down? What am I going to do here? So it's not like that, but public speaking generally, it is pretty much prepared topic. So if you, of course, are 100% prepared, then it can be an opportunity to actually work on that. Tone inflection, so tone of the voice, I think that it can be a little bit controlled, that you don't shout on the people when you talk to them and you are not being aggressive. That's also very important. So it is a good idea to, sometimes maybe you're not in the mood and you are really angry and you want to, like shout on them or something, but that's not working. Volume control, so that you don't speak too low on a very low voice because people won't be able to hear you basically, and that causes misunderstanding in the final end, or not very high because it can be misinterpreted as shouting and you being aggressive. Effective body language enhances your message, of course, and we say that in order to make yourselves more impactful or memorable when you have face-to-face communication, because on Zoom it's a little bit harder because I don't see you and you see me, right? But you don't necessarily see my eyes, I'm sure. So meaningful eye contact is very important. Purposeful gestures, so you don't have to, of course, exhibit the gestures for dancing, for example, when you give a speech about politics, unless you are Trump. Maintain good posture, that's important, so that, sometimes lecturers and professors are walking during the lecture. Sometimes they are standing, sometimes they are sitting, but that's a good posture, right? So no one is sitting, for example, in the posture of lotus, because that's not very accepted in the academic space. And control your expressions. Again, if you say something serious and then you roll your eyes, that will make people think that you're not being very serious about the message and overall topic of your communication. Speaking impact. So, speaking impact, generally to say, and for the last note, because I want to finish up with a really nice video as well, but still. So, the impact of your speaking is actually one part of communicating well. So, to have impact on your audience, it is possible. Even when we are sitting on Zoom, it is possible to have the meaningful communication with the person, even if you don't see them. And of course, content is very important. So the message that you send is very important. But again, it does not only include delivering a message, but also resonating with the experiences. So you have to understand the firsthand the values of the listeners, right? You have to understand what they are interested in. And for that, for instance, you can ask me the question now, well, how did you know that this would resonate with us, right? So for that, we did have amazing guidance. So we did have the program overview. I personally had the program overview that helped me to shape your presentations based on what you are interested in. So you have to resonate with the audience. That's very important. With your personal examples, I think also, which are very much contributive. However, sometimes audiences do not like personal examples, but sometimes they also prefer that. But you as a speaker, you as an interlocutor, you need to understand that you need to resonate with those people who you do presentation for. So you have to care about them. It's not only about, oh, I want to do this, so you have to do this. Then we have references, of course, that you will see here. And if you have any questions, of course, you will ask the questions, etc. And on the final slide, we have a credit of the design creator. It's not my contact, but it is absolutely the design creators. The person who did the template for this PPT is absolutely there to give some credit, right? Text belongs to me, but design is not mine, and I cannot take it, right? So I will share with you a little bit of a video here as an ending note. And it's going to be like fun ending note here because it's fun, basically. Those are the Trump handshake trolls. So as you remember, Donald Trump likes to pull the hand of the person very, very much. So with that, he tries to assert a little bit of a domination over the people. And this video has no sound, so I mean, no text sound, it's just the music, but it has very nice inscriptions. So if you are unable to listen to, audio for some reason, then there is a opportunity to actually look at the material. Right, so here it comes, and this will be the end note, of course, but still. Yeah, so I think that's a nice, very nice ending for the communication generally pattern in order to understand what a handshake can do, for sure, right? You also wrote it in the chat. So what a handshake can do, power. Yep, that is true. So thank you all for being today here, and thank you all for bearing up with me. Now, if you have any questions, I'm ready to listen, of course. Yes, if Haris.
Yeah, let me